What if the most feared woman in ancient history didn't rule with armies or laws, but with rituals so dark and obsessive that even her closest advisors refused to speak of them? Imagine a ruler whose power wasn't simply political, but psychological, built on daily ceremonies that blurred the line between devotion and terror. From the moment she woke, every gesture, every whispered chant, every symbolic offering was designed to reinforce one truth: fear was her throne, and ritual was the weapon that kept her untouchable. At sunrise, while the palace was still wrapped in cold silence, she walked alone through a narrow stone corridor etched with symbols from civilizations long erased. Servants claimed they heard her speaking to entities no one else could see, her voice low, rhythmic, almost melodic, as if the morning itself needed permission to begin. These rituals weren't random. They were calculated performances, anchors of control meant to remind her court that she commanded forces beyond politics. And the terrifying part was that everyone believed it. Her power grew not through battles, but through anticipation. People feared the moments before she entered a room, the quiet shift in air, the scent of burned resin from earlier rites clinging to her garments. She mastered the art of leaving questions unanswered, of allowing shadows to say what her mouth never needed to. Every whisper about her rituals became part of her myth, part of the machinery that made her untouchable. Because the moment fear becomes a story, it becomes a structure, and she knew exactly how to build it. But beneath that structure was an obsession she never allowed anyone to witness directly. She performed the same dark sequence at dawn, midday, and just before sleep, a repetition so precise that scholars centuries later would argue whether she believed in the rituals or merely weaponized them. Yet the truth hides somewhere between those possibilities. A ruler who lives inside the mythology she creates becomes something more dangerous than a tyrant. She becomes a symbol, and symbols are far harder to overthrow. Still, one question lingers like smoke. Did these rituals empower her, or did they consume her in ways no one dared to acknowledge? You might feel the same curiosity her subjects felt, the same pull toward the forbidden details that shaped her daily life. And if something in this story already unsettles you, ask yourself why. Have you ever sensed that leaders throughout history relied not just on force, but on carefully crafted illusions meant to dominate the human mind? If the weight of these rituals makes you wonder what they truly meant, share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding how fear is built is the first step to recognizing its power. And while you are here, remember to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, since what comes next might reveal even darker truths hidden behind her daily practices, setting the stage for the rituals that shaped an entire reign without ever being written down. The truth behind her rituals becomes even more unsettling once you understand how they began to shape the political atmosphere around her. People assumed these ceremonies were private acts of devotion, but slowly they evolved into something far more deliberate, something crafted to project a presence that lingered long after she stepped away. The early signs were subtle. Courtiers noticed that anyone summoned, after her midday rite, returned pale and speechless, unable to explain why the room felt colder or why her gaze seemed to stretch beyond the physical. These encounters created a pattern of silence that spread through the palace like smoke, thick enough to influence decisions without a single decree being issued. Her rituals worked because they operated in the space between fear and imagination. She understood that the human mind fills voids with the worst possible interpretation, and she allowed that psychological storm to build a power structure stronger than any army. Nobody could predict when she would perform a new rite or which symbol she would unveil next, and this unpredictability became a language she used to communicate authority. Even her enemies grew hesitant, unsure whether her influence stemmed from political strategy or something otherworldly. The line between superstition and governance blurred until no one dared separate them. Whispers spread that she kept objects from conquered territories arranged in precise positions around her chamber, tokens charged with stories of suffering and loyalty. Whether these items carried spiritual weight or were merely chosen to destabilize perception did not matter. What mattered was that her court believed they did. Belief is a force capable of reshaping entire societies, and she weaponized it with the precision of a ruler who understood the fragility of human certainty. Those who challenged her authority found themselves overwhelmed by an unspoken pressure, as if the rituals themselves marked them as targets long before she ever addressed them directly. One advisor described the sensation as entering a maze designed from her intentions, each corridor shaped by secrets she never articulated. It was this invisible architecture that granted her influence. She molded the expectations of everyone around her, turning ambiguity into dominance. When a ruler convinces her subjects that she knows more than she reveals, obedience becomes instinctive rather than imposed. And in that environment, even small gestures carried the weight of prophecy. A glance, a pause, a rearranged symbol on her table could shift alliances or ignite fear without a word. As her rituals became woven into the fabric of her daily governance, they began to form an unspoken pact with those who served her, binding them to a system of control they could neither escape nor fully comprehend. Something darker was unfolding beneath the surface, shaping the next stage of her reign in ways no one dared acknowledge aloud. Yet everyone felt tightening around them like a silent grip that promised to intensify. As her influence deepened, the rituals she performed each day began shaping the palace like an invisible tide, altering the behavior of those who lived within its walls. Governors, generals, scholars, and envoys all reported the same unnerving sensation whenever they approached her chamber, as if the air itself carried a quiet warning. Even before crossing the threshold, they felt pulled into an atmosphere crafted by her unspoken rules, a psychological terrain where she dictated the conditions without ever announcing them. The palace became a labyrinth of her making, its corridors echoing with tension that no torchlight could dispel. What made her so dangerous was not simply the rituals themselves, but the precision with which she placed them into the rhythm of her everyday life. At dusk, long after political meetings had ended, she walked alone across the inner courtyard, tracing geometric paths that no one else was permitted to replicate. Some believed she used these patterns to invoke protection, others to sharpen her authority, but to those watching from the shadows, the purpose was far more unsettling. Every movement seemed calculated to signal dominance, reinforcing the idea that she inhabited realms of influence unreachable to ordinary rulers. She created an aura of inevitability around her, decisions, as if resistance itself were futile. This atmosphere tightened further when rumors emerged about a hidden chamber she visited at irregular hours, a room sealed off by a heavy stone door and guarded by 2 silent attendants. No one ever saw inside, yet everyone could describe it with disturbing clarity, because the imagination of the fearful is a powerful architect. Some envisioned altars drenched in symbolic offerings. Others imagined scrolls filled with forbidden knowledge or relics, taken from the defeated to bind their spirits to her will. Whether any of these visions were accurate mattered far less than the impact they produced. The mystery became a tool sharper than any blade. Those few who attended her private councils often emerged shaken, unable to articulate what had unsettled them. They described her presence as something that pressed inward, compressing thought and emotion until speaking felt dangerous. She rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. Her silence had weight, and her gaze held the suggestion of secrets that could unravel a life with ease. People started preparing for meetings with her, as if preparing for a ritual themselves, whispering protective phrases, carrying small tokens believed to counter her influence, even though they never acknowledged such actions in public. It was in this environment of controlled ambiguity that her strategies thrived. She timed her decisions with uncanny precision, revealing decrees only moments after court. Tensions reached a breaking point, as if she sensed the perfect moment to strike. No one knew whether her insight came from political intuition or the rituals she performed in solitude, but the effect was the same. Each decision seemed predestined, each maneuver flawlessly aligned with forces no one could fully understand. And as her influence grew, so did the unspoken acceptance that her rituals were no longer isolated acts, but the unseen architecture guiding the entire realm, tightening its hold on everyone who stepped inside her dominion. The deeper one ventured into the reality she constructed, the clearer it became that nightfall transformed her world into something far more dangerous than daylight ever revealed. When the final torches along the palace walls dimmed, the atmosphere shifted with a quiet precision, as if the darkness itself obeyed her command. Servants reported hearing soft, rhythmic sounds echoing from inner corridors, not loud enough to identify, yet impossible to ignore. These sounds marked the beginning of her nocturnal rituals, ceremonies far more intense than the controlled rites she performed at dawn. Here, secrecy intensified into an almost tangible presence. Those who dared to observe from afar noticed she always chose the same secluded courtyard, its stone floor stained by centuries of unknown events. She would kneel at its center, surrounded by symbols drawn in a pigment that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Some believed it was crushed, mineral. Others whispered it was something taken from the defeated. The truth stayed locked behind her silence, but the effect was undeniable. The courtyard felt like a place where the boundary between the human world and something older grew thin enough to unsettle even the bravest soldiers. Witnesses described how she moved through the symbols with unsettling precision, performing gestures that suggested a dialogue with forces no one else could perceive. She held objects whose origins no scholar could trace, each one carrying an aura of significance that hinted at rituals passed down through forgotten bloodlines. And every night, without fail, she ended the ceremony by facing the palace directly, as if presenting herself not to her subjects, but to whatever power she invoked. Many believed this was the moment when her command over fear itself renewed. Her enemies grew increasingly convinced that these ceremonies strengthened her influence in ways beyond natural explanation. Before major political decisions, the intensity of these nighttime rituals increased. Before battles, the sounds from the courtyard echoed longer than usual. Before betrayals were uncovered, attendants claimed the symbols she drew glowed faintly, though no one could agree on whether it was a trick of the moonlight or something far more unsettling. These patterns fed into her legend, painting her not only as a ruler, but as a figure intertwined with forces that preceded kingdoms and outlived them. Even those closest to her could not escape the ritualistic framework she imposed. Generals found themselves making decisions shaped by fear rather than strategy. Advisors hesitated to speak, weighed down by the memory of her silent nighttime rites. In this environment, her authority extended beyond hierarchy. It seeped into instinct, shaping thoughts before they fully formed. What terrified people most was not the rituals themselves, but the possibility that she believed every part of them mattered, that each gesture, each whispered line, each symbol held consequences no one else understood. If any part of this world unsettles you or sparks a thought about how fear shapes authority, share what crossed your mind in the comments. Because understanding how these rituals molded her power reveals more than history admits, and your perspective might illuminate a connection others overlook as we continue deeper into her story. As the nights grew heavier with the weight of her rituals, the subtle machinery she built around fear became fully visible to those paying attention. It was never about the spells people claimed she cast or the spirits they imagined whispering through her halls. It was about the way superstition took root inside the minds of her subjects, turning simple gestures into omens and ordinary silences into warnings. She cultivated this atmosphere with remarkable precision, letting rumors grow just enough to remain believable, then reinforcing them, with symbolic acts that seemed harmless alone but devastating when woven together. She understood that the human mind is drawn to patterns, especially in times of uncertainty. So she created patterns everywhere. The placement of torches, the angle of her gaze, the timing of her footsteps, even the configuration of banners during ceremonies carried coded meanings people believed they had to decipher. Soon, her subjects began inventing their own interpretations, convinced that understanding her, symbolism was the key to survival. This was the brilliance of her strategy. By allowing fear to become a puzzle, she ensured everyone remained occupied with decoding her intentions rather than resisting them. Her rituals were no longer isolated events. They became a lens through which the entire kingdom interpreted reality. A shift in the palace atmosphere could be read as approval or condemnation. A single change in her attire could signal the rise or fall of a noble family. When she walked through the great hall, conversation stopped not because of her status, but because people feared missing the subtle sign they believed she carried in her presence. She had transformed herself into a living omen, a figure whose every detail demanded attention. This manipulation of belief was further reinforced through stories that spread beyond the palace walls. Travelers claimed that wild animals avoided the area where she performed her rites. Farmers insisted that the wind changed direction when she spoke certain words. None of these stories were verified, but verification was irrelevant. What mattered was repetition. Each retelling wove her further into the fabric of the supernatural, making her less a ruler and more an embodiment of something ancient and uncompromising. And the more people accepted this narrative, the more she benefited from it. Her influence also seeped into the legal system. Judges began seeking guidance from omens rather than procedure, convinced that her rituals aligned justice with cosmic order. Disputes were settled based on symbolic interpretation rather than evidence. People adjusted their behavior accordingly, fearing that even unintentional defiance might be interpreted as a challenge to forces beyond comprehension. Slowly, the line between governance and superstition disappeared, replaced by a system where fear maintained perfect equilibrium. What made this transformation so effective was how quietly it unfolded. No proclamations were issued. No threats were spoken. She simply allowed her rituals to become the gravitational center of the kingdom, pulling every thought, decision, and alliance into their orbit. And once this shift occurred, resistance no longer required punishment, because belief itself enforced obedience, binding the realm to her will through a power far more enduring than the sword. The deeper her influence penetrated the realm, the more clearly one could see that the machinery sustaining her power extended far beyond rituals performed in solitude. At the center of this structure stood a carefully selected circle of women, each drawn to her for different reasons, yet bound together by the same mixture of admiration, dependence, and fear. Some were advisors, others attendants, and a few were women who had risen from obscurity simply because she recognized a particular hunger in them, a willingness to surrender pieces of themselves in exchange for a purpose greater than survival. To outsiders, they formed a council. In truth, they functioned more like an extension of her will. Their loyalty did not emerge from affection or shared ideology. Instead, it was forged through a series of rites designed to test their thresholds. Each woman underwent a private initiation, details of which were never recorded but frequently whispered about by those who noticed the changes afterward. Some emerged with an unwavering calm, as if touched by a secret they could not share. Others became guarded and silent, carrying an intensity that hinted at unseen burdens. Whatever occurred within those walls, it bound them irrevocably to the ruler at their center, turning them into guardians of her secrets and instruments of her influence. Through them, her rituals transcended the confines of the palace and seeped into every corner of governance. They carried her symbols into negotiations, reenacted fragments of her rites in diplomatic ceremonies, and reinforced the idea that loyalty was not merely political, but spiritual. When disputes emerged among nobles, these women appeared like shadows, observing, assessing, and subtly shaping outcomes without needing to intervene overtly. Their presence alone redirected tensions, suggesting that the ruler saw everything, anticipated everything, and remained untouched by the chaos others struggled to navigate. This inner circle also served another purpose, one far more hidden. They watched one another with the same vigilance they applied to the rest of the court, ensuring that no member strayed too far from the expectations imposed upon them. In this way, the group maintained its own equilibrium, a quiet hierarchy shaped not by rank, but by proximity to the ruler and the depth of ritual knowledge each carried. Some women sought greater favor, hoping to unlock the meanings behind symbols they could not yet interpret. Others feared that understanding more would unravel them completely. Yet none of them dared step away, for separation from the Tao circle meant losing not just status, but identity. For many, the rituals offered a strange sense of belonging. In a world where power was often claimed through bloodshed or lineage, her system allowed them to anchor themselves to something larger, something that felt ancient and purposeful. Even if they could not grasp every layer of meaning, they believed the acts themselves granted strength, protection, or clarity. And once belief took root, it grew into dependency, a quiet tether that kept them within her orbit. The kingdom saw only their composure, their coordinated movements, their silent authority. They never witnessed the cracks that formed beneath the surface, the emotional cost of living within a structure woven from secrecy and shadows. Yet these cracks were beginning to widen, shaping the next shift in her reign in ways none of them were prepared to confront. The deeper the women of her inner circle sank into her world, the more they found themselves trapped between devotion and terror. Their loyalty had been forged through private rites that left marks no eye could see but every mind could feel. Yet even within this select group, hierarchy pulsed like a hidden vein. Some held fragments of forbidden knowledge, while others served merely as vessels to maintain the illusion of unity. What none of them expected was the cost of failing to meet her expectations, and this cost became brutally clear the first time one of them faltered. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A trusted attendant, known for her unwavering discipline, made a single mistake during a ceremonial preparation, misplacing one of the ritual objects by a fraction of an inch. No one else noticed, but the ruler did. Her gaze lingered on the misplaced symbol with the kind of silence that hollowed the air. The attendant knew what that meant, long before a word was spoken. For days she moved with the stiffness of someone awaiting inevitable judgment, yet hoping for a mercy she knew did not exist in this world. When the summons came, it was delivered without urgency, without threat. That was the most terrifying part. She entered the ritual chamber alone, and what happened inside became the subject of countless whispers. Some claimed they heard chanting that did not resemble any known language. Others insisted the torches flickered unnaturally, as if the chamber rejected what was unfolding within it. By the time the door opened again, the attendant emerged changed. Her posture bent, her voice hollowed, her eyes refusing to meet anyone's gaze. She continued to serve, but the spark that had once defined her was gone, consumed by whatever punishment had been enacted. This moment reshaped the circle more effectively than any command. Fear sharpened their discipline, pushing them to rehearse every gesture, every phrase, every symbolic movement with frantic precision. They whispered among themselves late at night, exchanging warnings disguised as cautionary tales, trying to navigate the rituals without becoming victims of them. But the more they tried to understand her expectations, the more impossible the task became. Her standards shifted with the seasons, with the moon, with the unseen logic only she possessed. Perfection became the only defense, and even that was temporary. Yet the most unsettling truth was that some women embraced the danger, believing the intensity of the rituals elevated them beyond ordinary existence. They saw themselves as chosen, marked by forces that demanded sacrifice and rewarded absolute surrender. The line between empowerment and destruction blurred until they could no longer distinguish devotion from fear. Each act became a test, each night a reckoning, each ritual a reminder that their identities no longer belonged to them. Their world had become a place where silence carried the weight of prophecy, where mistakes echoed louder than screams, where loyalty was measured not by service, but by how much of themselves they were willing to surrender. And as they continued moving through this system of shadows and symbols, one question lingered beneath their tense breaths, shaping their every decision in a realm ruled by fear. If any of this stirs something in you or makes you reflect on the hidden cost of devotion and power, share your thoughts in the comments, because the perspectives that emerge from stories like this reveal just how intricate and dangerous such systems can become when fear is the foundation holding everything in place. As her influence expanded beyond the palace walls, the rituals that had once been confined to private chambers began shaping the very structure of governance. Decisions once grounded in strategy or precedent gradually shifted toward symbolic interpretation. Officials lined up outside the palace at dawn, waiting to observe the slightest sign of her mood, searching for clues in the color of her garments, the arrangement of banners, or the cadence of her footsteps. These details became unspoken directives, guiding everything from military campaigns to trade agreements. No one dared misinterpret them, because misreading her intentions felt as dangerous as defying her outright. In time, these practices calcified into something resembling law, a ritualized framework that dictated the kingdom's rhythm as much as its ruler did. When disputes arose between nobles, ambassadors, or entire regions, the resolution no longer depended on evidence or counsel. Instead, attendants reenacted fragments of her rites, presenting symbolic objects or repeating specific phrases believed to mirror her will. Even the generals responsible for safeguarding the border adjusted their strategies based on omens associated with her nightly ceremonies. Battles were postponed if the smoke from her courtyard drifted in an unusual direction, or if the torches burned with what soldiers described as an unnatural hue. What made this shift particularly dangerous was how natural it felt to those who lived through it. Ritual brought a sense of order, a framework that promised predictability in a world defined by uncertainty. People found meaning in the patterns she created, even when those patterns were nothing more than carefully designed illusions. Over time, belief hardened into structure, and structure evolved into law, until the rituals became indistinguishable from governance. Those who questioned this system found themselves quietly removed from positions of influence, replaced by individuals more willing to align their decisions with the shifting symbols that defined her authority. This transformation seeped into daily life as well. Farmers waited for signs before planting crops. Merchants altered prices based on rumors of her rituals. Families postponed weddings or funerals if they believed the timing conflicted with her mysterious ceremonies. Even festivals that had existed for generations were reshaped to incorporate her symbols, ensuring that every celebration reinforced her presence in the public imagination. She had succeeded in folding the kingdom into her worldview, weaving ritual into every gesture until people no longer noticed the line between tradition and control. Foreign envoys reacted with a mixture of fascination and dread. Some arrived determined to negotiate through reason, only to realize reason held little weight in a realm governed by symbols. Others attempted to mimic her strategies within their own courts, hoping to replicate the psychological power her rituals commanded. But none managed to capture the same influence, because her system relied not on fear alone, but on an intricate interplay between belief, secrecy, and spectacle. She had spent years constructing this environment, and every stone of it bore her signature. The kingdom became a living extension of her rituals, a vast stage where every citizen played a role without understanding the script. And while the system appeared stable, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface, subtle fractures born from pressure, secrecy, and the growing inability to distinguish loyalty from survival. These cracks would soon shape the next shift in her reign, tightening the web around those who dared remain close to her power. As the kingdom continued moving in perfect rhythm with her rituals, a quiet instability began to stir beneath the surface, unnoticed by those who believed her power was absolute. It started with subtle shifts in the way people spoke about her. For years, their whispers had been shaped by awe and dread, but now the tones carried something different, something edged with uncertainty. Advisors began questioning decisions in private. Nobles weighed alliances more carefully, and even soldiers sensed a change in the atmosphere around the palace, as if the very air had grown heavier. But the most telling sign appeared within her own circle, where loyalty had once been unwavering. The women closest to her, once bound by ritual and secrecy, had started observing cracks in her composure. They noticed her hesitating before certain rites, pausing as if the symbols she had drawn for decades no longer obeyed her intentions. Some claimed she repeated gestures too many times, as if trying to correct an unseen error. Others insisted they saw a flicker of fear in her expression, something they had never witnessed. These moments were brief, quickly masked by her usual precision, yet they spread through the circle like whispered warnings. When a ruler built entirely from fear shows even an instant of doubt, the foundations beneath her begin to tremble. Rumors emerged about a ritual she attempted deep within the hidden chamber, one she had not performed in years. Servants claimed they heard sounds unlike any of her previous rites, a frantic rhythm that disrupted the palace at its core. Torches sputtered without wind. Birds abandoned the courtyard for days. Even the stone pathways felt colder, as though something beneath them had been disturbed. When she finally emerged, her attendants described a strange tension clinging to her like a shadow. She dismissed everyone without explanation, reinforcing the belief that something had gone wrong. This ritual, the one few dared speak of directly, became the center of speculation. Some believed it required channeling forces beyond her control. Others argued it had been designed to reveal betrayal within her circle. Whatever its true purpose, its aftermath shifted her behavior in ways that alarmed even her most loyal followers. She became more watchful, more selective, studying each woman with an intensity that bordered on suspicion. Meetings grew shorter, conversations sharper, and the sense of unity that had once defined her inner circle now felt fractured. Traitors had not yet emerged, but the fear of being perceived as one was enough to alter every interaction. Women avoided speaking too freely. They analyzed each gesture she made, searching for signs of disapproval. Even the palace guards noticed the shift, describing the atmosphere as too still, too controlled, as if everyone were trapped inside an elaborate performance where one misstep could unravel their fate. This level of tension revealed a truth her subjects had never considered. Fear could sustain power, but it could also consume the one who wielded it. What made this moment particularly dangerous was the growing realization that the rituals shaping her authority might no longer be reflections of strength, but attempts to hold together something slipping from her grasp. And while no one dared confront her directly, the kingdom had begun sensing the shift, feeling the tremor beneath the facade, waiting for the moment when her carefully constructed world would reveal the cost of maintaining dominion through fear. As the tension surrounding her rule tightened, the rituals that had once elevated her authority began echoing with a different tone, one shaped by the weight of everything she had built. The kingdom that once followed her symbols with unwavering devotion now watched her movements with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Even the air inside the palace seemed altered, as if it carried the memory of all the ceremonies that had taken place within its walls. People sensed that something fundamental had shifted, though no one dared articulate what they felt. Power maintained through fear can appear eternal, yet it is always most fragile when it seems untouchable. Her inner circle, once her greatest source of control, now mirrored the fractures growing in her reign. The same rituals that bound them together had carved deep wounds within their identities, leaving them torn between loyalty and self-preservation. They watched her with a different gaze, no longer assuming she commanded forces beyond imagination, but wondering whether the very rituals that built her myth were eroding her from within. For the first time, they saw her not as a figure of unstoppable authority, but as a woman carrying the weight of every secret she had invoked. And this realization reshaped their perception in ways they could not reverse. The kingdom reacted to these subtle shifts with its own quiet tremors. Farmers hesitated at planting seasons, unsure whether the signs they once trusted still held meaning. Merchants debated whether her symbols retained their predictive power. Generals began interpreting her silence, not as strategic insight, but as a signal of uncertainty, and uncertainty in the hands of those who lead armies can change the fate of nations. Even the envoys who once feared her supernatural aura now observed her more carefully, sensing an instability that made her both more dangerous and more vulnerable. Yet despite these cracks, the rituals continued. Every morning she traced the same symbols. Every night the courtyard filled with the rhythmic echoes of her chants. These acts, once demonstrations of her dominance, now carried the haunting weight of necessity. Each gesture felt like an attempt to hold her world together, to keep the fabric of belief from unraveling. In these moments, she seemed almost suspended between two realms, one shaped by the myth she had created, and another shaped by the reality pressing against its edges. And it was within this tension that her legacy took its final form. People began understanding that her power had never existed solely in the Bao rituals themselves, but in the way those rituals shaped their perception. Fear created obedience, obedience created myth, and myth built a ruler capable of moving entire kingdoms without lifting a sword. Even as her influence wavered, the imprint she left remained etched in the minds of those who lived under her rule. A ruler defined by fear leaves behind more than stories. She leaves behind patterns of thought, instinctive reactions, and the lingering question of how deeply ritual can shape the destiny of a people. If you reached this point and felt the weight of everything this story reveals about power, belief, and the human mind, consider leaving a comment with the phrase "I am here until the end," because your voice adds depth to the conversation these narratives evoke. If the journey through this tale resonated with you, subscribing helps you stay connected to the stories that explore the hidden mechanics of fear and influence. A like also goes a long way in supporting this kind of content. And if something in this narrative opened a new perspective for you, there is a video waiting that expands these ideas even further, so take a moment to click and continue exploring this world from another angle.